Of all the things most managers hate to do, giving feedback and having difficult conversations is often right at the top of the list. Choosing to actively engage in what often feels like a confrontational conversation is something no one enjoys doing, but unfortunately is a very real and continual aspect of a manager's responsibilities. It is also a skill that many actively avoid developing and only engage in when absolutely necessary, often at the behest of their own manager. The good news is that giving feedback does not have to be adversarial, and if done correctly, is actually one of the top ways to develop your people. If you ask employees, almost all will tell you that they'd rather know if there's an issue in the moment, rather than waiting until their performance review to find out they've been doing something wrong the whole time. Intuitively, we know this, but yet as managers, we still hold off on giving feedback in the moment to avoid rocking the boat in hopes that the behavior will correct itself on its own, which of course it does not. What actually happens is the issue becomes bigger and more impactful over time, and the feedback conversation itself actually becomes harder to have and carries more consequence for the employee. This then creates more hesitation from you as the manager to engage in further feedback discussions down the road. Now, there are a lot of different approaches to giving feedback, with the most commonly touted one being the proverbial feedback sandwich. This is when you say something nice about the employee or their work, then share some of your concerns, followed up by more positive commentary. The reason why this approach is often taken is because it feels unconfrontational in the sense that we aren't trying to make a big deal of the feedback we are giving, regardless of how serious it actually is. And while this can work for smaller, but trivial constructive feedback, it mostly discredits the feedback and comes across as disingenuous, almost like you're trying to mask the negative. Depending on the nature of the sandwich pieces, it can also be very confusing to the employee. Here's an example of that approach. You've been doing a really great job getting your work done on time and making sure it's error-free. But I did want to mention that you've been late to work for the last 5 days in a row, and I'm starting to get a little concerned that you aren't taking this role seriously. Having that been said, you're still doing a great job overall, and I'm happy you're doing such good work on the project I assigned you. How confusing is that? Are they doing a good job or a bad job? Whether using the sandwich method or not, the other thing I see a lot of managers do when giving feedback is that they label the behavior they want to address as being negative in some way. For example, a manager looking to give feedback about an employee's ability to run a meeting will often say something along the lines of, "You did a poor job running that meeting back there and I wanted to talk to you about it." When we use labels, the word poor in this case, what we are doing is sharing our opinion on the employee's behavior, to which the employee will often disagree and get defensive in their reaction, which in turn leads to a much more conflict-oriented, intense discussion. So now that you've seen the two most common ways managers give feedback to their employees and why they're not effective, let's talk about how to do so in a constructive and supportive way that helps develop the employee and encourages them to take ownership of their path forward by using what I call the forward-focused feedback framework, or the 4F method for short. There are 7 steps to this framework, which is an escalating model that allows you to adjust which steps you use based on the nature of the conversation and the seriousness of the feedback being provided. Not every step is applicable in every conversation. The benefit of the framework is that it can be used in conversations from providing in-the-moment feedback about something very minor, all the way to addressing the most serious of situations where an employee's job may be in jeopardy. The first 3 steps are all about awareness. They are the reasons behind why we're having the conversation, but are not the purpose of the conversation. So step 1, observation. In this step, we are simply sharing our observations of the behavior in question. We are not using any labels to describe the behavior, but rather just stating objectively what happened. For example, in that last meeting, I noticed you were speaking very quickly and were not sticking to the agenda topics. Step 2, impact. In this step, we are sharing the impact of the observed behaviors. This step is often missed, but it yet is one of the most useful steps in the framework as it helps provide context and awareness for the employees, who are often unaware of the impact their actions have. Let's layer this on to the observations from step 1. In that last meeting, I noticed you were speaking very quickly and were not sticking to the agenda topics. As a result, people had a hard time following the conversation, and because we didn't get to all the topics, we now have to have a follow-up meeting. As with step 1, it is very important to be as objective as possible by sticking only to the facts as best you can. Now, occasionally, the impacts being shared will have a degree of subjectivity to them, particularly if feelings are involved. Let's say, for example, that you have 2 employees and that employee A made a hurtful comment towards employee B, who came to you sharing they felt belittled by the comment. When addressing the comment with employee A, it can be very easy to default to saying something along the lines of, "You made some belittling comments towards employee B." In this approach, we are creating the impression that the employee did in fact use belittling remarks, which the employee may very well disagree with and will likely get defensive over, especially since the definition of what constitutes belittling is subjective to each person. A more neutral and objective approach would be to say something along the lines of, "You made some comments towards employee B that made them feel belittled." Do you see the difference? The latter is purely factual, even with the subjective nature of the feelings being involved. The feelings were presented as they were felt, which is based in fact, but we did not decide that the comments were themselves belittling. Step 3, check-in. In this step, we give the employee an opportunity to respond to the observations and impact. Some employees will naturally jump in at this point and offer up their thoughts, which can range from agreement to providing excuses. If the observations and impacts were shared in a neutral and objective fashion without the use of labels, the employee is unlikely to dispute the events themselves because they are grounded in fact. The easiest way to execute this step is simply through asking them their thoughts on the feedback being shared, or to get their take on the situation that played out, or to get a better understanding as to what happened and why. Layering on top of the previous 2 steps, incorporating check-in into the feedback conversation could look like, "In that last meeting, I noticed you were speaking very quickly and were not sticking to the agenda topics. As a result, people had a hard time following the conversation, and because we didn't get to all the topics, we now have to have a follow-up meeting. What are your thoughts on this? I'd love to get your take on what happened back there." As you can see, these first 3 steps are all about awareness as to what transpired and why we were sitting down having a discussion. It also gives the employee the opportunity to share their take on things and sets the conversation up nicely for the second set of steps in the model, which are all about moving forward, which should be the focus of any feedback conversation, as the employee cannot change the past, only how they act moving forward. Step 4, expectations. At this point in the conversation, it is now time to let the employee know what you need to see from them moving forward. For smaller, minor feedback, you may set general expectations. For example, moving forward, please be more mindful of your pacing when leading meetings. If the feedback you are giving is more serious in nature or is an ongoing concern, you may need to set more explicit expectations. For example, I need you to speak at a pace where you are not slurring your words and to avoid the use of slang terms. Moving forward, for any meeting you are running, I need you to address every agenda topic and avoid engaging in any sidebar conversations. Regardless of the expectations you are setting, the more clear the expectation, the better set up for success the employee will be, as there will be less room for interpretation. For example, if you were to say, "I need you to sell more money next quarter," that's a very ambiguous statement. As the employee, you might say to yourself that you'll go out there and sell an extra $100, which by definition is more money. But if, as the manager, I was thinking more in the $10,000 range, I'm going to be frustrated you only sold $100 more. This type of situation happens more often than not, and unfortunately, the employee is always on the losing end because they didn't meet your expectations, even though they often thought they were doing what was expected. In this situation, if you want the employee to sell $10,000 more in the next quarter, say exactly that. That way they can better figure out the most appropriate actions to take to get there. Building off the previous steps, here are 2 separate approaches to setting expectations for the employee moving forward. If the issue is minor. In that last meeting, I noticed you were speaking very quickly and were not sticking to the agenda topics. As a result, people had a hard time following the conversation, and because we didn't get to all the topics, we now have to have a follow-up meeting. What are your thoughts on this? I'd love to get your take on what happened back there. Moving forward, please be more mindful of your pacing and make sure you stick to the agenda. If the issue is more problematic in nature, we can adjust the expectations to, "Moving forward, I need you to speak more articulately and control your pacing to a point that you are not slurring your words. I expect you to stick to the agenda topics only and that you hold off on having any tangential conversations." Step 5, accountability. This step is the one that many managers, especially newer ones, rarely bring into feedback conversations. In my opinion, this is the most critical step in the framework when warranted, as this is where employees step up to take ownership of their path moving forward. Unfortunately, the majority of managers often stop with setting expectations, with the employees often stating they understand what's expected moving forward, even if they don't, so that they can get out of the conversation as quickly as possible. To help an employee take ownership of their path forward, the next step is to ask them what they plan to do differently moving forward to ensure they meet your expectations. If during the check-in step of the model, they talk about factors that contributed to their behaviors, you can also bring them into the accountability step of the conversation. Let's layer in an accountability question into the example we've been tracking to show you what this could look like. "In that last meeting, I noticed you were speaking very quickly and were not sticking to the agenda topics. As a result, people had a hard time following the conversation, and because we didn't get to all the topics, we now have to have a follow-up meeting. What are your thoughts on this? I'd love to get your take on what happened back there. Moving forward, I need you to speak more articulately and control your pacing to a point that you are not slurring your words. I expect you to stick to the agenda topics only and that you hold off on having any tangential conversation. What can you do differently moving forward to help yourself in these areas? What can you do to ensure you run a more targeted and controlled meeting? If during the check-in step the employee mentioned some reasons for their behavior, let's say they shared that they stated they didn't have enough time to prepare ahead of the meeting, which caused them to stray from the agenda, you can bring those factors into this step of the conversation. In this situation, in addition to asking what they can do differently moving forward to meet your expectations, you could also ask them to articulate how they will ensure they are better prepared moving forward. For a lot of employees, being asked accountability questions as part of feedback conversations is not typical. The majority of the time, they will be unable to answer the questions on the spot, nor should we expect them to if we want a well thought out and meaningful answer. With that in mind, it's very appropriate to ask them to take some time to think through their plan for improvement on their own and circle back to you at a later date, maybe in a day or two, or at most a week later, to walk you through it. The benefit to having them come up with an action plan for themselves is that it forces them to think critically about the feedback and their own improvement moving forward. By them reviewing it with you, it also gives you the chance to validate the plan, give feedback on it, share additional considerations, or challenge them if you see a big issue with the plan. One thing to watch out for in this step is when the employee responds to the accountability prompt with something along the lines of, "I'm not sure what I can do moving forward. What do you think?" Whatever you do, do not bite. As soon as you give the employee a path forward to solve for their behavioral concerns, accountability on their behalf is gone. If your idea doesn't work, then it was your steps that were the issue and not them, at least in their eyes. It is critical that the employee come up with the path forward for themselves first, before you offer up ideas as their manager. Step 6. Consequences. After we put it to the employee to come up with a path forward for themselves, the next step is to introduce potential consequences if the expectations that were shared are not met moving forward or by a certain date depending on the feedback. We often think of consequences as being those that lead to an employee's eventual termination, such as having to escalate the issue to a senior manager or HR, being given a formal warning or write-up, or perhaps even going on a performance improvement plan. And while these may be the appropriate potential consequences to introduce given the context of the conversation, the reality is that those consequences are typically reserved for more serious or ongoing performance concerns. For most feedback conversations, especially if they are taking place in a timely manner, the consequences are typically smaller in nature. Examples could include suffering reputation damage, team members not wanting to do work with the employee anymore, being reassigned to another work stream, or losing a responsibility. Looking back at our example, let's layer in sharing potential consequences into the conversation. In that last meeting, I noticed you were speaking very quickly and were not sticking to the agenda topics. As a result, people had a hard time following the conversation, and because we didn't get to all the topics, we now have to have a follow-up meeting. What are your thoughts on this? I'd love to get your take on what happened back there. Moving forward, I need you to speak more articulately and control your pacing to a point that you are not slurring your words. I expect you to stick to the agenda topics only, and that you hold off on having any tangential conversations. What can you do differently moving forward to make sure you can meet these expectations? If you aren't able to change your approach and meet these expectations, I'll have to consider letting somebody else lead these meetings. One big thing to consider when introducing consequences is that you must be willing to follow through on any that you introduce that you would have control over, such as escalating upwards or taking away a responsibility. Failure to execute on consequences, if warranted, essentially gives the employee a free pass on the behavior and no reason to change their behavior moving forward. Step 7. Follow-up. If we are taking the time to give employees feedback, we should also be taking the time to follow up after enough time has passed to see if progress is being made against the feedback or not. If you do not follow up after giving feedback to an employee, especially if you've used most, if not all of steps 1 through 6, you are in effect signaling to the employee that the feedback you are giving to them is not important to you. When the efforts they put into improving go unrecognized, employees often revert back to their old ways. When employees choose not to make the required improvements, failing to follow up, be it through not actioning on the consequences that were introduced, or with additional steps from the feedback framework being leveraged in future discussions, this signals to the employee that the continued problematic behavior is permissible. So, after you've given feedback, it is important to take note of the shifts in employee behavior and to recognize the improvements as you see them. This will help positively reinforce that they are doing a good job, make them feel good about their improvements, increase the likelihood of them continuing to make improvements, and signal to them that you are invested in their development. On the flip side, if behaviors continue to suffer or the needed degree of improvement is not there, a follow-up conversation should be held to discuss the continued issue using additional steps from the feedback framework and/or through the execution of consequences. Let's look at what follow-up discussions 2 weeks after the feedback conversation that we've been tracking might look like. Scenario 1. The employee has improved. I just want to follow up on the feedback I gave you a few weeks ago about needing to speak more articulately and keep meetings on track. I've noticed a huge improvement and wanted to recognize the effort you've been putting in. It's been paying off. Keep up the great work. Scenario 2. The employee is not improving. I'd like to have a follow-up discussion about the feedback I shared a few weeks ago about needing to speak more articulately and keep meetings on track. I've noticed that the behavior is still ongoing. In that last meeting, for example, it was hard to understand what you were saying, and again, the meeting agenda was not followed. Your peers are becoming increasingly frustrated with attending your meetings. I'd appreciate your take on why things haven't improved. At this stage, I'm going to be stepping in and leading these meetings moving forward. I still want you in attendance, but now as a participant until you're better able to slow down your pacing and better stick to the conversation topic at hand. To briefly summarize, the steps are observation, impact, check-in, expectations, accountability, consequences, and follow-up. Now that we've walked through the model, I want to reiterate a few things. The first is that this is an escalating model, which means that not every step is applicable to every conversation. In fact, you can even skip steps if you like. Smaller, timely, and minor feedback will often only use steps 1, 2, and 4. For example, I noticed you spoke very quickly in the meeting back there and you lost the audience a bit. Please be mindful of your pacing moving forward. If the issue persists, add in step 3. If it continues still, bring in steps 5 and 6. The idea here being that this framework is a tool, not an instruction manual. Use it to meet the needs of the situation and don't be afraid to experiment. Secondly, make sure you are intentional with your tone of voice when giving feedback, as that is almost as important as the feedback itself. If you take a lighter tone of voice, then the employee is going to get the sense that the feedback isn't that serious. If you use a serious tone of voice, then the employee will think the feedback is very important. The key here is to adjust your tone along with how many steps in the framework you use. Less steps should have you use a lighter tone of voice, and more steps should have you take a more serious one. I hope you found the 4F method for giving feedback helpful and feel better equipped to get out there and give some objective feedback to your staff.